Briefly, there are three types of support for Wheaton Arts. Keep in mind that you can become a membership, you can donate to Wheaton Arts, and you can also go to shop.wheatonarts.org. If you would like more information or to discuss different types of giving support, contact Rhody Barron, the Director of Development at Wheaton Arts. I'll also put her information and some other links in the chat, but you can reach her at rbarron@wheatonarts.org. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Pamela Wakeman and get right to the program. Pamela is a ceramic artist, arts administrator, and educator. She's taught for Rowan University and for Wheaton Arts. You may have met her running the family activities on site at Wheaton Arts. She received her Bachelor of Fine Arts at Rowan University and her Master of Science at Drexel University. Her favorite thing about teaching and creating art is the challenge it presents to find new approaches to understanding and interpreting the world around us. And over to you, Pam.
Marcy, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Hi, everybody, and thank you for joining us here tonight. It is my pleasure to be here with you and to introduce my co-host and our guests. My co-host for this evening is Kristen Qualls. Kristen manages the day-to-day staff, programs, and operations of the Museum of American Glass. She was an integral part of the award-winning 6-year project Emanation. She currently serves on the board of the New Jersey Association of Museums and acts as a reviewer for the statewide artifact assessment program. Qualls received an MFA in Museum Exhibition Planning and Design from the University of the Arts, and she received her BA in Science, Technology, and Society from Vassar College. Kristen, thank you so much for joining me here tonight to talk to our guests. Next, it is my pleasure to introduce our guest. First, I'd like to introduce Norwood Viviano. Norwood's work is about change, utilizing digital 3D computer modeling and printing technology in tandem with glassblowing and casting processes. He creates work depicting population shifts tied to the dynamic between industry and community. By showing how landscapes and populations move and are modified as a result of industry, his work creates a 3D lens to view that which is invisible or forgotten. Norwood was a fellow at Wheaton Arts in 2016 and is currently on the roster as a guest artist for 2020-2021. Norwood is currently an associate professor and sculpture program coordinator at Grand Valley State University. Norwood, thanks for being here with us tonight.
Thank you.
Our second guest is Dr. Jennifer Kitson. Jennifer is an assistant professor in the departments of art and geography, planning, and sustainability at Rowan University. She is an urban cultural geographer with a research interest in the geohumanities, a field at the nexus of geography, art, and humanities. Her scholarship explores the role of the senses, emotions, and memories in the experience of place. She is the 2019-2020 New Jersey Council for the Humanities Waterways Environmental Humanities Scholar, leading an NJCH funded project exploring the connection between people, place, and water through public storytelling. She has led water story programs at Wheaton Arts in 2019. I'm pleased to welcome her tonight for this program. Thank you both for being here with us tonight.
Thank you, Pam.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Pam.
Oh, you're so welcome.
Should I get started?
Yeah, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Pam, and thanks to Jen, my collaborative partner in our engaged and her engaged students. I'm going to just give a quick overview of my work and try to weave some of the conceptual concerns and questions into the way that Jen and I approached at least our discussions for this collaboration. So I have a wandering relationship with glass. I've known about Wheaton probably for about 30 years. I started working in glass in 1992. So I learned about Wheaton not long after that and started working with glass at Alfred University, and found myself through learning about glass at places like the Pilchuck Glass School that, there were lots of things going on in glass that I was interested in, but I also wanted to push the potential of the material. And so I actually ended up getting a master's degree in sculpture and returning to glass in about 2010. So this is a project that I created at the Museum of Glass in Tacoma with one of the most talented glass teams probably in the world. And so one of the things I was doing before I created this project, I grew up in the city of Detroit, and I was struck by the dramatic changes that happened in the city, both in terms of my experience living there, but also returning to the city several times after having moved away for college and other kinds of things. And so this project is a project that compares 24 American cities. And I assume you can see my cursor here. This is New York City here. And these projects are proportional. So each one of these pieces represents a city. And the length of them is based on time. And the width of them is based on population. So these are some of the things that I grew up looking at in the city of Detroit. And in a lot of ways, I think I just grew up and thought everywhere looked like Detroit. And in good ways and in bad ways, you can compare Detroit to a lot of other American cities. I think Detroit has actually transformed a lot in the last 15 years, and for better or worse. But the Michigan Theater on the left, and then Michigan Central Station, which is going through a process of being restored now. So one of the things that making this work that is essentially data visualization, I had no idea when I first started exploring this work that I was connecting my work to a whole host of ways of thinking about data and science. And so when I exhibited that previous project that I showed, Cities Departure and Deviation, at the Houston Center for Contemporary Craft, I met a scientist, and he, we had a really intense conversation. He's a biologist, and he said, I'm going to send you some images. And this is an extinction map that, you can tell where we are today up here at the top. But what was really, obviously this is devastating, but at the same time, what was fascinating about that conversation was that we connected in so many ways. And the thing that was the kind of flux for that conversation was the fact that we were using some of the same ways of communicating. And so to create these blown glass projects, before I go into the hot shop, I spent a lot of time researching. And so in Rhino, which is the 3D modeling software I use, I basically create a spreadsheet. And then since everything's proportional and everything's drawn proportionally, I can just, I can change the size of everything. I can, because there are limitations to the glass blowing process. Obviously, Wheaton has the largest glass bottle in the museum that I think was ever blown. I don't know if that's ever been contested or not, but in a reasonable situation, there's a scale to that process. And so when I'm working on a project like this, I sort of scale the largest piece based on what's reasonable and the smallest piece based on what's reasonable. And so the other thing about the work and the other thing about my practice that's important to me is that even though the objects don't always look this way, they are very much handmade. And so I'm interested in the way that others that help me along the way or work with me on projects influence the work. While we start with drawings that maybe are generated in a computer and look incredibly precise, there's a certain amount of imprecision that happens in the way that the work comes out as a physical object. And so the objects are, again, very much made by hand, and using calipers and several steps. And so within these projects, I often use color as a tool to describe different kinds of demographic information or different kinds of change. So other aspects of working this way, laying out data this way, is I was able to see relationships between American cities that I hadn't seen before. So the way that I laid out the data, I was able to see that, a city like Atlanta, Georgia, which has a very different history from a city like Seattle, actually has really similar growth patterns when you start looking at population change, especially over the 20th century. I also include in my projects data on the wall. These are, I sort of think about these like drawings, but these are actually vinyl cut. And I also want to say that, you know, this was the first project. Right now and through 2021 is a project that's very similar to this at the Museum of American Glass. This project looks at cities that went through the most dramatic kind of increase and decrease in population. The Manufacturing Cities project looks more specifically at manufacturing and its influence on population change. So, and again, here's just a close-up to show the relationship between the vinyl and the blown glass objects. So my work often, you know, I don't always work in series, but my work is often driven by the questions from previous projects. And I think a lot of artists work that way. So I don't always know what I'm going to do, but I tend to get a lot of questions along the way that I sort of pack into somewhere, some kind of archive, and that archive then answers questions for me in terms of what I should think about or consider next. And so the Global Cities Project very much came out of the Cities Departure and Deviation Project, although there's real challenges to managing data sets across various international places and times. And so I was able to access this data through lots and lots of research. You'll notice that these objects look very different because, again, we're talking about thousands of years of data rather than, you know, 300 years of data. So in fact, these objects are half the size of the previous project because, again, we had to negotiate the glass blowing process. This is the vinyl component for the project, or a portion of the vinyl component. And I think it's an important part of the project because it gives the project context. Within all of these projects, I'm often thinking about, you know, how are people going to relate to it? I'm okay if people just think, oh, these are compelling objects because glass is a beautiful material. But I also want people to think more about the depth or the relationships between the individual pieces. And so I believe that the vinyl is one of the tools for that. I'm also, you know, as an artist, I am drawn to the material and process and its history. And so here, you know, while making these projects, I included the Reticello technique, which is a 16th century Italian technique where you actually include layers of cane as part of the process. And so, you know, and here we're doing not just one layer of cane, we're doing 2 layers of cane going in different directions. And so for me, not only was it a historic connection, but it's also a way of talking about kind of systems and networks and structure within a city. And so if you look at this object from the side, you know, this is Shenzhen, China, which went through dramatic population change from about 1979. And so that Reticello pattern actually stretches across that surface. And as it stretches, it changes. So like the previous project, I didn't really talk about color in the previous project, but it has meaning and it has a connection. I used color as a way of talking about age of the cities. So you have this sort of like radiating, almost like tree rings, thinking about the age of a city in relationship to where it was on that map, hanging over that map. This project now lives at the Corning Museum of Glass and is actually in the process of being installed, I believe, permanently. And I talked about this a little bit in terms of the previous 2 projects. You know, I'm not the kind of artist who works in a way that I work just on one series, and you could look at my work from 20 years ago and you could understand that it's specifically related to me. I think maybe over the last 15 years, you could say, well, he's an artist that focuses on relationships between cities or questions that are tied to cities, and they're expressed in a certain way. So I've been working on the project Mining Industries for about 6 years or 7 years. And so it's not about the mining industry specifically. It's about the idea of kind of digging through and understanding the industrial relationship to community. And so I mentioned that I grew up in and around the city of Detroit up until I was about 18 or 19. But now I live in this, this small town in Western Michigan that has a abandoned paper mill. And it's been really fascinating becoming connected to the community and understanding the transformation of the community that the community has gone through as the main source of income in the town left. In the last 10 years, I've also become aware of this technology called Lidar. And so Lidar is essentially a very similar technology to, what's used on the highway to track your speed. So they send out a laser beam, it bounces off, it comes back. The difference is this airplane is tracking millions of points of data, and those points of data can be turned into a 3D model, very much like a three-dimensional snapshot of the landscape. And so when I start a project, and I'm going to go through some of the steps of my process just to give you a sense of how I approach things. When I start a process, I often start in Google Earth because it's the easiest software to use. I can create essentially a cutting shape that I can go into Lidar, which has, and everything's world coordinate based. So it lands where I want it to land in a world of millions of points that I can't really understand, and it allows me to delete things that I don't need. And so this is a Lidar point cloud, and you can see and this is downtown Boston. So if you know downtown Boston, you'll see some of the landmarks, at least in the water. But the color is based on elevation and gives you a little bit of information. As I work with the data, clean up the data, I have to wrap the data. So I have to take those points and turn it into a surface that can be 3D printed. And so this is the point before something is sent off to be 3D printed. This is not the same file, but a file I did for a client in Washington, DC. And so one of the things that's also interesting about Lidar is that it's sort of political in the sense that it's not always available. Sometimes it's free and accessible, and sometimes it's not. So for many years, I tried to get the Lidar data for New York City. I sent many emails and made many Freedom of Information Act requests. And the first one I made, I got an email response that said, "How do you know the data is available?" From one of the head IT people. And there was an article in the New York Times that was really about solar mapping Manhattan so they could figure out where to put solar panels that could benefit the city most, based on where they had the most sunshine on buildings. The next email I got within about 10 minutes from somebody else said, "We don't have the data," which in fact they did, but they wouldn't release it. They've released a form of the data now that is not very usable, but it can be cleaned up and used. And so once I get through the 3D printing and 3D modeling phase and Lidar and all of those steps, I'm working pretty traditionally. If you're familiar with the processes, I work pretty traditionally with lost wax casting. I mean, for many years, I did lots of foundry work. I run a sculpture program, as Pam said, in Michigan. And so in many ways, I teach more sculpture techniques than I do glass techniques. I do a lot of bronze casting with my students still. We do stuff from digital 3D printing as well. So here's all of my steps. I've got my wax pattern from my rubber mold. And so this kind of orange material is a rubber mold. And then this white material is a plaster holding it. And then my waxes that were derived from that mold. And then I set up this for investment casting. For those of you on the call, like one of the things I would say is for casting, it's really critical that, things have to be as even as possible. Casting is one of those things that probably glass really doesn't like no matter what. So you've got to do everything in your power to make it work. And so here I am putting in styrofoam to kind of offset the thickness of the mold so that I'm going to get the mold as close to 2 inches as possible so I can drive my heat in and I can get the heat out of the mold when I'm cooling it. And then I pour my investment material. I put my mold in an oven, which melts out all my wax. And then I have a mold that's ready to put in the kiln. I load it with glass. And so the interesting thing about a mold like this is that there's no way to load the glass in here because I basically had to create stilts to put the glass in. It's about 75 pounds of glass. So, you know, like it's pretty unnerving bringing something like this up to temperature. It takes about 3 days to get up to temperature because that glass might just all fall over the side of the mold. And then I basically lost my kiln. I've never quite happened. I've had to replace elements and things like that, but I might sound a little dramatic, but you know, a mold like this size in a kiln, this size, I could definitely lose the kiln. So here's the mold up to temperature. It's approximately 1550. 3 weeks later, I have an object that looks like this. And then, you know, you see the molds break down. That's just the nature of the process. But within this mining industries work, this is a project I created for the Speed Art Museum. The project on the left is downtown Louisville. The project on the right is the Martiki Mine in Lovely, Kentucky. You'll notice there's a reflection below these pieces. So what's reflected is, and Jen and I have talked a lot about this, and it's a really important tool for understanding the landscape from before. Essentially, you know, sandborne maps were used as ways for insurance companies to understand what the landscape was when cities were burning down in the latter part of the 19th century and early part of the 20th century. Aerial photographs essentially replaced that technology, but I have that reflection, and so basically you can see the early part of the 19th century is, or sorry, early part of the 20th century is reflected in the mirror, but what you see on the top is the fairly current Lidar, cast in kiln cast glass. And the mine on the left is the coal mine, which had a sort of a peak production in 1980 and has been slowly kind of whittled down to maybe 10% production. And so when I'm stacking my glass, I'm stacking in a way that I want it to look like it's sort of like strata or earth, you know, because glass has a memory in terms of how you stack it. It has a memory in terms of what it looks like when it's done. And there's a predictability to that and an unpredictability to that. So here's the aerial photograph from approximately 1945, and then the Sanborn maps. And Sanborn maps, like every map, have a code, and so typically this sort of red or pink color are bricks, you know, brick buildings, and all of this is gone in downtown Louisville. So this is the mine, and I'll just show you. This is the reflection underneath the mine, and so on the left, you know, it's sort of like if you can imagine a split screen. On the left is an aerial photograph from about 1954, 1950. I get my aerial photographs and a lot of my Lidar from the USGS. And so this was before the mine was ever in production. On the right is when the mine was sort of in its peak production. So you can see the dramatic change in the landscape. While I was at, and I'm going to sort of jump ahead because I think that this recast project is an important part of, I think, how Jen and I connected. I was a fellow at Wheaton during the spring of 2016. And all I can say is, you know, I've had the opportunity to do a few residencies, and they always are really impactful. I think sometimes when you're in the middle of them, it's hard to know how they impact you. this residency in particular, I think, I had just finished a couple of really challenging projects, and I rolled into this residency thinking I was going to start doing one thing, and in fact, I ended up doing something very different. But I brought some old 3D prints with me and did some experimentation. And so Wheaton also has the resources of kilns and facilities that not a lot of other places have. So I was able to make larger work than I could make in my studio. So I took this 3D print of the city of Detroit and grafted it onto an engine block. And you can see the mold room at Wheaton in the background. And for me, this new body of work, which grew out of this mining industries work, was very much about thinking about these sort of iconic objects, these industrial objects, capturing a certain amount of their character within the framework of the object, but also thinking about how the urban landscape and the object meet, because it's a really, I think it's an important component to that. And I think each one of the objects within the series is a little different. And so that's the wax version. You know, you see that I didn't cast the whole object because I don't think you need the whole object to hopefully have an interesting finished result, but also to sort of tell the story. And like I mentioned before, you know, this is setting up the mold. So using styrofoam to displace, you know, fairly simple mold making. I mean, I can make more complex molds, but for a lot of the work, I tend to make fairly simple molds, fairly direct. And then this is the mold before it goes in the kiln, or well, I should say it's in the kiln now, but I'm loading the glass into the mold and then it's going to get fired. And that's about a 3-day process to get up to temperature. And then this was a 3-month annealing cycle. So it sat in the kiln for 3 months. And then this is the excavation process. And so I actually, I'm not sure if I'm supposed to say this or not, but because it was a 3-month process, I actually put this in the kiln and I came back later. And to be totally honest, since I had made nothing like this before, truly, I had no idea if it was going to work or not. And then of course, it takes 2 days to excavate this. So I could have invested 2 days, and I have invested 2 days in a project, just removing the investment material, and it's not worked. So that's a different kind of problem solving. But luckily, this worked. And this is just a detail. And I used, you know, I remember thinking a lot about this. You know, this idea of like transforming an iron object into glass, you know, dealing with the fragility. I think there's a whole series of questions there, but thinking about how the inclusion of iron in glass actually changes the color of glass to green. So bringing that, you know, the idea of the industrial glass process sort of back to this object. And then I've made a series of other pieces. I have a show opening in March at Heller Gallery in New York. That's going to be a fully developed version of this. But like I was saying earlier on, I really didn't know where that this body of work was going to go. I thought, well, you know, this is just a experimentation, and it had to sort of sit on the shelf for a little while. And then now it's sort of developed into a series of pieces, and I don't fully know where it's going to go, except I do know what pieces I hope to have for this show in New York. And I would say, you know, as an artist, and I would say as an academic too, you know, this process of sort of learning and making mistakes. I often tell people that, you know, working with glass is one of the most humbling processes or practices that you can endeavor, because even if you've done something 15 times and it's worked, it's not necessarily going to work that 16th time. And then you're sort of back to, and I don't think it's just a technical process, because I think that there are conceptual things that can work and then they don't. So this is Pittsburgh, made in steel blue glass, gaffer glass. And this was a piece that I made for an exhibition at the Grand Rapids Art Museum. I rarely get to actually do much in the way of exhibitions locally. And the Grand Rapids Art Museum was having a glass exhibit. I had other work that was traveling. It was a traveling exhibit. I had other work in the show, and the curator said, "We want you to make something new for this show because you're local. And we want something that is based on kind of your current direction." So I used that opportunity to research a little bit more about the furniture industry in Grand Rapids, which was really vibrant in a really different way. It was vibrant because in the early 20th century, it was very much an immigrant population, and that population brought a lot of skills to making in the city, and then those skills got passed along to other workers, which is why the Grand Rapids became a furniture center. There's still Hayworth, Herman Miller, and Steelcase here as well. So this is a small table that was made by the Imperial Furniture Company in the 1930s. And alongside of these pieces, I show a vinyl graphic. This is a printed vinyl. So this goes on the wall kind of next to the work. And this just gives you kind of a window into what the landscape was much earlier than the Lidar. And so oftentimes you can see in this, there's still, even though this is, you know, the furniture industry is starting to wind down in 1955 in Grand Rapids. It's moved a lot of production and moved to the south. But a lot of this area around the kind of the water feature, the Grand River, was where most of the furniture production was. And that is the tabletop. And so I took the Lidar and kind of grafted it into the table where there was actually an inlay. So I took the inlay out and put my own inlay into the city, or sorry, into the table. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Does anyone, should I go ahead and just
Yeah, why don't you go ahead,
transition?
Jen, and then we can answer questions.
Okay. So thank you, Norwood. I'm going to share a bit about our class experience this semester, and I don't know, including our creative engagements with place, past, and South Jersey glass. As Pam mentioned earlier, I hail from Rowan, which is a public research university in Glassboro, New Jersey, just 25 minutes north of Millville and about 25 minutes south of Philadelphia. And I have research and teaching interests in the use of creative methods to study and represent place, but I'm a geographer and not an artist. And my research practice is interdisciplinary, collaborative, and community-based. So this opportunity to work with Norwood and WheatonArts on this class was really exciting for me. And I should mention too that this partnership also has been advantageous in advancing the mission of the art department's new Institute of Innovative Media Materials and Design, also known as, the acronym is IMAD, which supports collaborative and cross-disciplinary innovations in expanding thinking around materiality. So this class really fit in and advanced that mission as well, and was intended to be a class of not necessarily artists and entirely people who do not have glassworking skills. The class itself was designed to really explore the South Jersey industrial glass landscape through these arts and place-based methods, or what I refer to as creative geographies. It's sort of a whole field that works in tandem with the arts, and it tends to include practices like walking, writing, poetry, mapping, photography, collecting, and creating. And so the goal of this class was really to generate new understandings of place through our research collaboration and a series of creative responses to the legacy of the South Jersey glass industry. And we did this through a combination of field work, which I'll show you some photos of today, and weekly reading and creative responses that the students did, and many Zoom meetings with Norwood, which aren't visually featured tonight, but they didn't translate as exciting as they actually were. So they're not really in here this evening. And our interdisciplinary team first met on the very first day of class at WheatonArts. And I'm pretty sure we were the first public group to visit after the pandemic shutdown, which lent a palpable sense of excitement at being part of a learning community again. And of course, there were also very serious considerations with COVID, and we really had to navigate pandemic-safe social interactions, which at this time, in the very beginning of September, was actually new for all of us. And so we kind of figured it out together. And I have to say, I'm going to just speak on behalf of all the students. I may misrepresent them, but I think it is safe to say, and Kristen can chime in at any point, or Pam, because they also had input into this class experience. And so they knew what students were thinking a lot of the time as well. But I have to say, we really began the experience at WheatonArts in a state of awe by the embodied and muscular knowledge involved in working with glass. You can see sort of sketched there in the middle. From the beginning of our, I think, 4+ hour tour that day, we were just really struck by this fellowship of glass workers in South Jersey, and in the factory, in the craft studios, and among the contemporary glass artist community. Also, very memorable was this was communicated in the glass blowing demonstration that Skitch and Eric did, which really got students thinking about human hands and bodies that make objects through this series of choreographed movements that were really new to us, and, as I mentioned, awe-inspiring. The raw power of the furnace also makes a visceral impression on this day, and so does the symbolism during the pandemic. The furnace had been turned back on for the first time after COVID, the COVID-19 shutdown, and students were observant in the way the glow of the furnace radiated hope in interesting ways. And then, of course, we enter the Museum of American Glass, and we're greeted by the line from Carl Sandburg's poem, Millville, which is displayed in the beginning. And it really resonated with us as we started to imagine this range of feelings that were likely evoked by the furnaces aglow in the late 19th century. After the bottle demo, we had the pleasure of meeting Norwood for the first time. And thanks to Pam's logistical wizardry that made it possible. And we met Norwood and really got to be introduced to the work that we were about to experience in the museum shortly. And this was very exciting, I think, for all of us, and me in particular, because I had not seen his work either in person. And I have to say that the experience of meeting everyone on this single day, and the way that they all participated in the entire day. So Pam and Skitch and Eric actually joined us for the entire tour in the museum, led by Kristen. The kinds of informal conversation that we were able to have through navigating the extensive museum collection with such a knowledgeable team really sparked a lot of interesting questions that continued to percolate throughout the entire semester. And we began to feel like we were not only learning about the South Jersey glass tradition and its fellowship, but in some way we were participating in it, in this sort of fellowship forged through glass by spending time and conversation with such knowledgeable people. And as part of our effort to build community engagement into this research collaboration, Kristen and I sort of hatched a plan for students to submit their weekly creative responses or glass studies into a shared Google folder so that our sort of research team could access them. And in turn, Kristen could compose WheatonArts blog posts based on what we were thinking about and experiencing in real time. And this provided a generative way for us to continue the conversation that really started on our first day at WheatonArts and continued throughout our various field excursions and our Zoom meetings and readings. And you can see here, sort of on the left side, Darien Brown. This is a portion of her first glass study, which she was responding to the kinds of impressions that were made from our visit to WheatonArts. And she produced a digital collage that was intended to juxtapose the familiarity of consumer glass goods with our unfamiliarity of the people and processes that create them. And on the right side is Alana's photograph, which she made in response to the unique qualities of light that glass creates as a result of the properties of heat. And I think it's been really interesting to hear Kristen's distillation of these first impressions into themes, which then provide new perspectives for us to think about our own experience. And anyone can chime in along the way. So also important to mention is the tremendous interest in glass whimsies in the museum and the way that they seem to really humanize the 19th century glass workers through conveying their creativity and humor, and this idea that they were experimenting with the molten remainders of the glass factory floor to really make something new struck the students and came to inform their own sensibilities in thinking about how we might work with found materials on our field excursions. And here, David's glass study included this meditation on things that shouldn't be made of glass.
I enjoyed this a lot just because it gave me a challenge to find these things already made out of glass that were in the museum collection. And I know we ran into at least a couple of them when visiting the Heritage Glass Museum as well. So it's always fun for me to see if it exists, someone's tried to make it out of glass.
Yes, I think you did burst David's bubble. He thought he had invented whimsies. In fact, they already existed. So another example in this case, I think the critical capacities of contemporary glass art also featured prominently in student reflections and helped them probe the history and materiality of glass in new ways. And so in this example, this is a photograph that Kimani made in the American Museum of Glass of contemporary artwork that got him thinking about African masks and identity, which he then connected to the history of glass beads as a form of currency in the slave trade. And so he is currently taking a jewelry class, and he began a project to work with glass beads from found glass and turn them into wearable jewelry as a way to engage with and kind of reclaim this history in interesting ways. And of course, masks were on our minds for other reasons, to COVID. And along the way, the class really began designing strategies for publicizing and promoting our collaborative efforts to creatively engage with South Jersey glass. This was a face mask design that we had difficulty manufacturing by hand, desired methodology. But some of the creative responses are going to live on in the archive, as Norwood mentioned, from this semester. And I think that, or at least the hope, is really that seeing a lot of creative questions. We are going to also inform, this archive will inform, I know, my own research, but also hopefully Norwood's work when he returns to South Jersey. Our visit to WheatonArts and to the museum, really sensitized us to glass. We became attuned to the presence of glass in our everyday lives in profound ways. But when we returned to Millville again on our second excursion, we did so to really explore the industrial history and heritage and ruins in the landscape. And this took place through Kristen's wonderfully curated driving tour. And I don't know, Kristen, do you want to?
Yeah, sure. These two pictures. The first stop is right across the street from the Nipro glass factory, which is a tubing factory. And I wanted to stop there because it's a working factory. And so I wanted the students to hear that ambient noise that comes from an active factory. They seemed less engaged with that, but they were really engaged with the fact that a train stopped through, and I had couched the tour in saying, count the number of times we go over the train tracks, because trains are so important to the industrial heritage, well, of America as well as glass. And as if on cue, this train pulls into this working glass factory. I don't know if it was dropping off raw material or picking up items that were being shipped out, but they were really excited to see an actual working cargo train.
Which you primed them for.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And as you note in this picture, again, we're just sort of standing there looking afar into the working factory. It's really difficult. It can be very difficult to get tours inside, for safety reasons, obviously, but also proprietary reasons of a working glass factory.
Yes, I think we would have tried a lot harder if we weren't living with COVID conditions, I think, for sure. Yeah. So we carried on from the Nipro factory, the sort of working glass factory, and we did so in pandemic safe caravan style, a lot of fossil fuel consumption, but it was pandemic safe. And because we couldn't be in the car together, sort of pointing along the way, we instead listened to songs about glass to provoke our imagination. We arrived at the site of the former Wheaton Industries factory, which you can see in the distance. And I'll just point out a few things. Kristen can take over here at any point, but you'll notice that Kristen is looking this direction. She's standing upright and waiting for us at our cars. And the students are hunched over on the ground, sifting through very, very small pieces of glass.
Yeah, I think, I'm not sure, and if there's anyone who's viewing this either live or later when it's up on our YouTube channel and have more information, please feel free to reach out to me and share your stories. But I think this was an employee parking lot. And yeah, as we pulled up, you guys got really excited and we're like, glass! And at first I thought, oh God, they're not used to driving in a place where there's glass all over the place and they're mad at me for their tires. But no, they immediately started like grabbing bags and picking up glass. And I kept being like, look at the big factory. There's this big, awesome factory over here. And they, as you can see, were like not even 5 feet from their car and just hunched over, sorting through, you know, cull it basically.
Yes. And despite trying her hardest to grab our attention, once Noelle found this, what I believe is a sizable piece of slag, maybe, she fully lost them. They were off into the poison ivy that she was trying to point out, yelling to them as they ran. They ran away from the factory into the vegetation, hunting pieces of cullet or slag. And I think this was a moment, a pivotal moment for both Kristen and I in this class, because I really began to think about gleaning, the practice of gleaning and gleaning glass as an apt phrase to describe our research comportment this semester, both sort of a bodily comportment and a perspective. And we knew that the bodily choreography of blowing glass was impossible for us to learn, but the arts of collecting were within our reach. And I think it is interesting that hunting sea glass and collecting antique bottles from the region are also local South Jersey glass traditions that forge fellowship and attune the senses to this place and this material in generative ways.
I mean, it was part of the founding of WheatonArts. Is our founders, you know, had a collection of old glass bottles from South Jersey, and it started there.
That's such a good point that did not occur to me. That's yeah, so we're on to something here. It's been done and great things have come out of it. So we really are continuing the tradition. I think in emphasizing this experiential act of foraging for remainders of the historical glass industry in and through place, we really caught on in some ways to the imagination of the glass industry in South Jersey. And I think the sensual imperative of ruins was really significant for our thinking. And as Kristen mentioned, along our tour, in addition to the broken pieces of glass and slag, really what remains of the glass industrial landscape is the environment in so many ways. And so that the waterways, the railways, woods, clay, and sand were foregrounded for us on these excursions.
Yeah, that was the Morris River, right, in downtown near Captain Buck Park, where the earliest glass factories in Millville were. And now, as Jen has, could talk more about, there's a lot of places where the industrial landscape has turned back into nature preserve or parks. So it's an interesting reclamation of the land. The reason the glass was here is because of the land and the ecological resources, and now we've kind of moved it back to it being a place where you can appreciate the land.
Which is what she geniusly brought us to. These are not all the stops on her extensive tour, but to sort of cut to the last stop at the Menantico Ponds, I think Kristen really curated our thought in this way, and it had a big impact because this was a former sand mine that supplied Millville's early glass work. And this idea that we were at the site where the material kind of originated that gave rise to the industry lent a certain aura to this place. And interestingly, when pieces of glass were nowhere to be found, this comportment of sort of searching the ground and the environment for clues and for environmental information meant that students started to be drawn to cicada shells and tree frogs and mushrooms, sap, seashells featured prominently. And sort of here we are in one of the famous South Jersey blue holes, as I would come to learn. And I think probably here at the end of our tour was where we really felt this sense that the environment is witness to and catalyst of the South Jersey glass industry. And we were reading and sort of thinking with Rebecca Solnit, her essay titled The Ruins of Memory this week, where she writes about the generative cycle of life and death, both biologically, but also industrially, and the way this makes ruins sensible. And so it was here that we kind of really felt glass as a creative force, and really through sand. That sand was our way to continuously engage with this creative materiality in South Jersey. And so while Norwood wasn't physically with us on these excursions, he remained a guiding influence. And you can see, I think, this here in Noelle's proposal, project idea for grafting, or she's thinking sort of with Norwood's approach to grafting objects and environments from these industrial landscapes. And she proposed a project to measure and map and cast in glass the voids created by the sand mining industry in South Jersey, which created these famous and kind of magical blue holes. And when we weren't in the fields, we were also thinking about ways to acquire spatial data to inform our research in similar ways that Norwood has introduced in our class. And this collaboration actually presented a pretty cool opportunity to digitize the 1982 archaeological survey of historical glass houses in South Jersey, which was undertaken by the Wheaton Historical Commission and a grant from the New Jersey Office of Historic Preservation. And Wheaton generously shared their hard copy. I believe Kristen said there are 2 in the state. So they generously lent their hard copy to the Heritage Glass Museum, who worked with Rowan Digital Libraries, or the Rowan Libraries Digital Scholarship Center, to get it scanned and searchable. So for the first time, this digital document can be publicly shared, which is pretty exciting. and speaks to the public engagement goals of our collaboration, because this survey is really the only comprehensive effort to document and map, importantly, the mapping of the historical glassworks. And students in the class learned how to locate high quality digital versions of the Sanborn maps and hexamer maps that they had to work with the 1982 surveys to sort of find the photocopied versions, which here they found the quality digital versions of the Sanborn maps. This is for the Whitney glass, I should have pointed out. This is one of the records for Glassboro, and it includes the Olive Glassworks, which was formerly the Stenger Glassworks, which sort of founded the town in 1779. So there's this long history of this particular site, which then became the Whitney Glassworks. And this is the Sanborn map. And then we worked with Dr. Ashley York's Fundamentals of GIS class. She's a colleague in the geography department, and she worked with her students to geo-reference the digital Sanborn maps so that they can be viewed and explored in Google Earth. And we hope that by the time Norwood comes for his 2021 residency, that he'll be able to start his project in Google Earth using some of these historical maps that we've digitized. We also attended a lot of the WheatonArts programming this semester, which was fabulous, including the Immigration and the South Jersey Glass Tradition Symposium. So we were able to get exposure to thinking about sort of the community, demographic, immigration, overall population related history. We also, thanks to Diane Wood's consultation and sort of the impressions that were made at the Menantico sand mines, we really got interested in further engagement with sand and other ways that it was sort of at work carving and creatively shaping this place. So we foraged for sea glass in Fortescue and thought about both the material itself, so sea glass as a vanishing material, and also about the landscape itself as a vanishing landscape, because the breakhead here along where we're standing is barely standing, and Fortescue itself and the surrounding communities are where some of New Jersey's first climate refugees come from. And so I just wanted to conclude with a few other examples of the kinds of creative responses that students are making in their efforts to explore landscape change in South Jersey. And this is Darien's proposal for a South Jersey Zen garden using sand she collected at the Menantico Blue Hole and at Fortescue Beach. And she was sort of interested in representing this relationship between the glass industry and this elemental material, sand, and the ways that it can sort of be performatively raked while meditating on the role of time and place. And here you see this assignment actually this week. I think the glass study was actually called "What Would Norwood Do?" And I mean, that just has a ring to it, and it was very successful for students to put themselves in Norwood's position and sort of think about, especially the recast series, And here you can see Kimani's proposing to take an object of the South Jersey glass industry, the mason jar, and display it horizontally with a landscape interpretation of the town. I don't know how well this will work. We didn't get into the details with Norwood's consultation on this, but the South Jersey Crowley town and the sort of topography of it, I'm not sure they would translate and make for the kind of effects that Norwood's work really does. But I think that the concept here was pretty interesting, and the way that he was thinking about how to merge objects and landscapes in compelling ways. And then the last example was sort of intended to circle back to the influence of that first day at WheatonArts, and also the principles and sort of community building efforts I think that we all really valued in our collaboration, and that Wheaton fosters in South Jersey, is represented here so Kimani took this photograph of the glass mosaic work outside of the buildings at WheatonArts on the very first day. And we didn't see this image at the time, but later on when we were touring Glassboro, where the university is located and where there is very little visible evidence of the glass industry itself. And this tile mosaic, which is on the ground in front of the former Stanger General Store, which is now owned by the Methodist Church, there is this sort of hidden, it's kind of off the sidewalk a bit, there's this mosaic, and the students became really interested in advocating for its restoration as a symbolic gesture of repair, and to kind of mend the relationship between the town and the university, which has suffered, I think, in the last several decades. I mean, the university and the town have partnered on urban or downtown redevelopment, which has been very successful, but it has also meant the loss of a lot of iconic buildings and the historic landscape that was there. So they further, Mackenzie, who is a community and environmental planning student, she kind of further advocated that we work with local organizations, including Creative Glassboro. They had recently commissioned a glass mosaic piece in town. And so they really started proposing creative placemaking projects that could provide opportunities for residents to experience new forms of mosaic work, restore the existing Stanger mosaic, and kind of build in more opportunities for students and community members to engage with their glass history through arts. And so it all has sort of come full circle in a lot of ways. And we're excited to see where the students end up in a couple weeks. The semester will end, and they're doing an installation in the student art gallery on campus. So more to come. And I think that's it for me.
Thank you, Jen. That was fabulous. It was so interesting to see all the students' projects at the very end. If anybody has any questions, either for Jen, Kristen, Norwood, please feel free to insert them into the question and answer section now. I think it's been a really interesting few months that we've spent kind of formulating this class and talking with Norwood about his process, and having that really influence the students on top of what they're learning about South Jersey glass history. So thank you all for your input and your expertise and making it a successful semester, for sure.
Especially since, I think when we all started this project, we didn't necessarily think it would be COVID times. So, you know, the flexibility with which we were able to take this initial idea and still make it happen successfully, with a lot of, you know, creative thinking on everyone's part, and, you know, getting outdoors and still being able to use that idea of the walking, to experience the environment, and the use of technology to connect us through Zoom so that Norwood and Pam could talk with the students about art and art making. Yeah, so I'm glad it all worked out, and not just because we got that giant glass survey digitized, which has been a dream of mine for like the last decade.
Fantastic.
Oh, right. And actually, we might be able to share that
Oh yeah.
if no one's clamoring for it in the chat, but I'm sure that's
Oh, Emily wants it.
All caps.
Emily said she wants
yes.
it.
Absolutely.
Okay. Maybe Marcy will share it, or maybe
okay.
I'll share it.
I'm just going to communicate something that came in question and answer. Penelope said, thank you very much, Norwood. Detroit is an unknown art mecca for most of the country, driven by the fur industry and then autos. I attended Cranbrook and loved being in a much more design-oriented environment. Okay, so I'm gonna, I think we have one more, let's see, nope. Okay, we have no more questions and answers at this time. I'm gonna share my screen. Okay, so if everybody would like to learn more about Norwood, his website is posted there below his name and his picture. If you would like to contact Jen to learn more about her research and her work, her email is there at kitson@rowan.edu. And as always, Kristen and I would absolutely love to hear from you. If anybody has any questions about anything we talked about tonight or any programs that we have coming up at Wheaton, we always love to connect with our audience. So please feel free to contact either of us. Our next Wheaton conversation, as we mentioned in the beginning, is going to be with Beth Lippman and Erica Rosenfeld. And that is on Thursday, December 19th at 6 p.m. So please register for that if you haven't. If you're interested, we will put the link to that in the chat momentarily. I'd like to thank not only the guests and the co-hosts tonight, but also everybody in the audience for joining us. If you close out your Zoom tonight, a survey will pop up. So please do take a moment to fill out that survey. It really does help us create program that is interesting to you and programming that you want to see in the future. So thank you, everybody. It's been a pleasure.
Yes, thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.